What's good, everybody? My name is Alckemy. Welcome to the channel. You guys know that I like to cover all things drums and neuro bass, but I think that I would like to try something different and make some content based off of community feedback. So I asked the question, what kind of production topics have you all searched for on YouTube and have yet to find? Feel free to answer this or let me know in the comments, or I don't know, give me some topics to cover. But Dap Fader says, I now have an answer to this question, but I really struggled to find this information when I was looking for it some years back. How do I know when to compress and when to not compress? And as a side result of that question, how do I know how much should I compress? You could rephrase the question as why I might choose to compress something over not compressing it, but I find that you get a slightly different answer that fully doesn't answer the first question always when worded like that. But as always, apart to answer the first question, it's a tough one. And you're right, it is a tough one because that is so specific when you talk about something that's actually relatively artistic, which is mixing, right? So first of all, I have a particular way of things that I like to compress and things that I don't like to compress. But what I want to talk about more so is the function of what compression does before we talk about different use cases, right? Because I could just show you a bunch of tips and tricks about why to do things, but really I want you to understand what the heck this does in the first place. When you talk about dynamics, you've got loud parts of a sound and then you've got quiet parts of a sound, right? So if I were to look at this waveform of this kick right here, you can see that right here this is loud and then right here this is loud. And so sometimes when it becomes a sound that's either a single sound or a bunch of sounds together or whatever, you're usually compressing something by trying to squash the dynamic range something has. There's a trade-off to that, because the way that some things work, because they're time-based, might take the whole entire sound, or it might take a portion of the sound and let other things come through, and that's where your attack and release comes into play. So if I were to use, I wish I had something a little bit more visual, but we're going to use the glue for this, and an oscilloscope, I believe. So if we take a look at these drums, it's just a break that I've pitched down. This is actually really good because you can see that I have the kick is really loud and then everything else is very quiet. So if I were to start to turn the threshold down on this, what that basically means is how quiet is the signal going to start to compress things. Because right now it's at 0. So that means that because it's at 0, the threshold means that it's going to take volume to reach that maximum of 0 before the compressor starts to activate. So if I were to start turning this down, notice what's going to start happening to the waveform. And I think I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so that people on small screens can see. So check this out. Now I don't know if you noticed or not, but that kick just became the same size as the snare. And so now we're actually on an even playing field because we've reduced that whole sound and allowed us to have an even playing field in which to turn things up. So because I reduce this, right, and this is just the first part, but because I've reduced this, now what this means is I can find other ways in which to bring this back up and actually make it louder because everything is on the same playing field. The reason why you would want to do that in the first place is because if you have a bunch of stuff that's really quiet and really loud, it's very difficult to work with on trying to level things because, you know, say like you have somebody that's doing a solo on a guitar and sometimes they play really hard and sometimes they play really soft, but it sounds inconsistent. Or sometimes somebody's drumming and they play a kick that's really hard, but then, their snare is really inconsistent. Sometimes if you want everything to be super squashed, that could be a good use case for this. In my terms, when I like to make bass music or whatever drum design, my goal with everything is to get everything loud as possible, as loud as possible. And the trade-off is that it only leaves room for a few elements of a track, but I like to do that because if I can make my bass and my drums loud, then I don't really need a whole lot of else, right? Likewise, if I'm doing something heavily melodic, then I'd back off of the compression by quite a bit because I want there to be things that are going to be emotionally humanistic or something, or have a lot of nuance, right? Compression a lot of times removes, not every time, but can remove a lot of nuance. So with this, right, with compression as a whole, we're trying to control dynamics. Now the other thing about this is that this is only talking about downwards compression, right? So I'll show you the other stuff here in just a second. So check this out. We're going to turn the peak clip on And I'm going to set everything to the fastest time because we'll talk about time in just a second. Now, because I squashed everything, I was able to bring everything else back up to a consistent volume. Again, if I were to pull this back down, or even turn this off rather, so let me go ahead and just A-B this. So now everything is back at 0. The kick is loud, right? Everything is like kind of all over the place as far as dynamics go. But now everything is relatively at that 0 mark. And so that's one way that you can achieve compression or use compression in a useful way. How much you push the makeup gain is one thing. How much you play with that threshold is another thing, but that's just a very basic use case about why you might want to do something like that. Now, the other thing is that you can actually make transients lesser, more impactful by playing around with the attack and the release, right? So when we're talking about threshold, we're talking about the volume, right? What is the maximum, or at what volume, what gain is going to is the signal going to have to pass in order for the compressor to activate? But what's really interesting is that because this is a time-based thing, we can also use that to say, hey, you know what? I really want those transients to pop out more, and I want the rest of the signal to duck very quickly. So that way it makes my sounds seem more percussive or more staccato. So what you might do on that for kick and snare or for drums or something is to turn up the attack. So that way it's saying, hey, even though we've crossed this threshold, we're going to wait about 30 seconds or milliseconds for that transient to pass through at full volume, and then we're going to crush everything. So now if we do that with the attack and the release by turning both up, we might have more transients now. Now this isn't the most extreme case, but hopefully you can hear how the kick has a little bit more thump. Right now it's actually making something that sounds like a distorted like doof. And because of that, this is just one way that you can achieve making your transients come out a little bit more by using compression. And again, these are basic concepts. I'm not trying to rewrite the wheel here or reinvent the wheel, but there's some things that you can do with that. So I'm going to pull this back and we're going to make everything pretty even again. So now we're at the maximum loudness. Now, if you didn't know, there's actually different kinds of compression. You have downwards compression, you have upwards compression, and you also have something called expansion, which some people categorize with, with upwards compression, but it's a little bit different, primarily because we've got a bunch of settings on here. And actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up MB. I should have done that in the first place, to be honest. So with this, MB is really interesting because if you look at this multiband here, I'm going to remove these, I think, for the sake of efficiency. But if you take a look at just this band right here, right, you can see that this little green thing is pushing this down. And this is the range here. So you can see that this is folding itself down, and whenever this yellow thing bends, that's the threshold. So if you keep the threshold up, it's not doing anything. Very little. If we start to pull that threshold down, you can see that this curve here is moving down towards that range. How much is that range? So what that means is not only are we going to reduce it, but how much are we going to reduce it by for a plugin like this? Now, the other thing that's interesting is that we can also set this to go upwards, right? So now this would be upwards expansion. So what this means is we're going to start at a higher volume now, or a higher range, and whenever this hits, it's going to go down to the 0 crossing mark. So that means that it's going to flatten out, right? It's going to start at a higher level, and then whenever it hits, it's going to say, whoa, duck the volume very quickly back to its original state. Now, the other thing is you have expansion, and what this is going to do instead is it's going to start here, but when it hits, it's going to push it up. So now watch. So when it comes into these use cases and it comes into why would I use these, it depends on what kind of signal you're actually getting, right? It depends on what you want to do. Let's say you've got some mids here on some chords or whatever, and you're like, you know what, like whenever that comes in, I just want this to pop up a little bit more, but I don't want to turn the overall signal up. That's when you might reach for something like multi-band compression to try to raise everything up just for that moment. Or maybe you only have one note through an audio track that's in the mid-range that just isn't doing it for you. The caveat to everything is that there's so many ways to solve a problem. There's so many ways to manipulate audio and MIDI or whatever comes out as sound as a whole that, like, you know, some people might prefer to do things with dynamic EQ, which is very similar, right? If you were to pull up, what's it called? If you were to pull up Pro Q3, with this, it's actually a little bit more specific because you can kind of go and use this dynamic compression either this way or this way, but it's frequency based. And the multiband compressor is also kind of frequency based, but there's a specific different functionality that I can talk about in a different video. But basically, let's say, like, you know, I've got this like flute that's coming in, but every time it hits that G, it just isn't really popping out. Well, I could use that to, you know, or let's say I want to use this on a snare. Versus you can really hear the fundamental of that snare drum now. You can actually be like, oh, this sounds really good, or this is actually kind of pushing that, I don't want to say presence, because people usually describe presence of like the 5 to 6K range, but you hear the thump, or you hear just the yeah, I guess fundamental would be the way to say it. Sorry for not being more concise. So compression and drums usually go hand in hand because there's so many different ways to manipulate your drums and to create really interesting timbres and tonalities. You know, something else that we could use just for an example would be like, let's say you're like over distorting your drums, right? So if we were to put Distube Culture, which I've got a review coming out soon if this video isn't already up already, but so this little guy right here is a crazy distortion unit, right? And just because it is so crazy, I'm going to put a clip around here, which we should be talking about more than compression really, but that's a whole different deal. This is just going to make sure that it doesn't freaking destroy my speakers. But so if I were to mess with this, we're going to go pretty hard with this, and we're just going to start to pull this up until it starts to break. Okay, so can you hear how by using this distortion, like it's starting to, you can hear the room a lot better. You can hear the tail end of this. Well, this has a setting on here called dynamics, which if you turn the compression on, which is kind of interesting, this is pretty much compression as a whole, but if I were to turn the compression on, listen to the tails of this drum. You hear how the tail of the snare is like, sometimes that can be useful in a creative way. Like if you have like one really big snare and you just want to pull the tail end of that out from like massive amounts of distortion. So let's say we were to just, let me just, yeah, because this is an audio, whenever this stops, it stops. But if you were to have reverb on this and then pull the compression up on this, it would be, it would try to elongate the tail of this. Whereas if I were to turn it over to the left, which technically is categorized as gating, but it's basically setting a long release time, just like how I was showing you with the glue, that everything is going to sound more staccato. So sometimes compression can help control tails and transients as well. I will say, just as a, you know, just as and foremost, because we're talking about this, use clipping and saturation before you go for compression. Compression, when used subtly, can be really good. Something that I like to do whenever I'm trying to make drums really big, like let's say I wanted to, blow this thing up or whatever, is I will do parallel compression. Because what parallel compression can do is decrease what's called your crest factor. So if I were to just have some kind of bass line on this or something, right? So let's just find a bass or something in here. Okay, whatever. It doesn't really matter. But if I were to maybe pull this over here, so that way we've got both two elements playing with each other, so drums and bass. What you'll notice on this is that you'll see that if I were to freeze this, hold on, let me catch it again. Now, if you look at this form, you've got these different things on here that have both peaks and overall kind of loudness, which I like to categorize this as a really stupid thing called centipedes, because this is the body of the centipede and then these are the legs. Now, whenever you are trying to identify the difference between your peaks and your RMS, the transients are the peaks, the RMS is the overall loudness, but the difference between this is called your crest factor. And a lot of times in mastering, what you're wanting to do is decrease your crest factor from your transients. So if you were to do compression, because it's time-based, sometimes it's not always the best use case, because if I were to throw a glue on this, on the overall signal, then let's take a look at what happens. So I've got one here. Let's say I wanted to, push those transients out and stuff, and I'm doing this to the whole signal, and I'm going to drive it like way too hot. Well, we still got some peaks and stuff, so it's not absolutely terrible, but well, as you can see, we've pretty much created our sausage now, which is what you might see on a lot of SoundCloud waveforms and stuff. But the problem with it is that it doesn't sound very good. So one trick to kind of find a nice middle ground in between is to do exactly what I just did, of pushing this too hard and doing what's called parallel compression or New York compression. So we're actually going to back off of this mix and slowly mix this in until we have a nice middle ground in between. So this is obviously, this board is too hot. Now what we're going to do is we're going to completely back off of this and just try to see if we can mix this in to slowly decrease that crest factor. Now the cool thing about this is that, and obviously like I just pulled in a random sample and loop or whatever, okay, so take this with a grain of salt, do more research on it. So if I cover a concept that you're like, oh, what does this mean? Don't be like, oh, Alckemy said this, like figure it out for yourself, right? But I will say that from this and having, it doesn't need to be right at 50, but just as a means of trying to create and decrease that crest factor, if we look at this, see how this is kind of all over the place? And now this is a little bit more consistent, just a little bit, right? You could definitely smash this if you want to, but that's kind of what we're trying to achieve whenever you use parallel compression. And you can do this with a ton of effects. It doesn't just have to be compression. You can do it with distortion. You can do it with, some kind of tape saturation, or you can do it with, the reverb on a snare or something to where you mix it in. But that's kind of the concept behind the whole New York approach, is that you take something and you gently mix it in against the original. The glue in particular has what's called delay compensation, so you're not going to have any kind of phasing or anything going over the sort. That's just a really nice perk of Cytomic, the glue. And if you're in Ableton, then it's pretty much the exact same thing, except this one has a few more controls, and this also got oversampling on it, which can be pretty nice. So with that particular use case, yeah, you can do parallel compression on drums and stuff, and obviously I'm focusing so much on drums and this and that or whatever, but another use case that I find to be extremely handy is if you have some kind of crazy resonant either like instrument or pad or something of the sort that's creating stuff. So I think a good example of that would be something like this, which is a bunch of sine waves. You can see that we're getting like some crazy distortion. If I were to pull this into a limiter, now the thing with this is that if you look at this on a slice EQ, you're going to see that these are just sine waves. So of course it's going to be super resonant. And the issue with it, even if we were to, pull some of this back, is that sometimes if you do have a more complex sound, if we were to just pull off the fundamental, well, that's just us making it more quiet, right? So sometimes what you can do is you can limit the dynamic range of how loud this can be. So it might make more sense to compress this first, so that way it's not giving you such resonant peaks and stuff, in order to control how loud these sine waves can get without it seeming too like shrieky peaky. But now that we have this, maybe say with a fast attack and a long release, we can turn the ratio up or whatever. Well, now we can kind of work with this a little bit more, because if we pull up a slice EQ, sorry, your camera's in the way, my camera's in the way, we can pit this up against the limiter, and you can see that no matter how hard I crank this, it's a little bit more consistent now. It doesn't quite have such a harsh... That's a great example of that. So if I were to turn this off with the distortion, take a listen to how this is going to sound. Now if I were to compress this, so it doesn't quite completely get rid of it, but it does help reduce it a little bit, and also can help you with shaping a timbre, right? And I think that's one of the biggest things, is shaping timbres with compression, because sometimes when you push something really hard into either a compressor or a limiter or whatever, you're going to get things that are unexpected, such as artifacts, or sometimes things that are desirable, especially when you're doing creative types of creative types of sound design. So really, all in all, it's hard because there isn't really one use case for compression. And as I said before, there are so many different things and ways to use this tool. And then there's a bunch of different ways that you can achieve the same result, but with a different tool. So I will say that I would just practice, and not practice trying to find the right answer of using compression, of is this the right choice? Is this the right thing? But use it sparingly, or actually no, use it on all different kinds of stuff. And then focus on what it's doing to the sound. And then you need to ask yourself, do I like this? Or does it help me achieve something that I was having a problem with? So if you're having trouble getting your drums loud because your kick is hitting your limiter too hard, sometimes it might be good to clip it or compress it. So that way all of your drums are like this now. That's pretty much just white noise. Then you could be like, blow it up. If your drums aren't hitting hard enough, right, then sometimes you can use a long attack, long release for your kick and or snare. They're going to be different, so like not necessarily the same times or whatever, but you might be able to beef up your snare and your kick by doing something like that. A lot of times with this, it's all about control, right? Sound design is about being a control freak. And that's kind of a weird thing to say because I've been doing sound design for so long, and I would like to think that I'm a relatively chill person, but having complete control over exactly what the sound does and how loud you let it get, and when to open it up, when to force it through something that says like, hey, I want you to play, but it needs to play nicely with all these other elements, so I'm going to force you to, you know what I mean, to like not go past this threshold, to not go outside of this narrow hallway that I've created for you. These are different use cases in why you might want to do that. If you're brand new to either mixing or to production, everything that I just said with this video, throw it in the trash. Unless if you're trying to do side chaining, which I guess I didn't cover. I guess I could cover that as our final thing. When and where to compress and how to side chain. I'm surprised I didn't even talk about that. So, but I guess to kind of drive a point home, focus on the composition. Don't worry about all this like crazy technical stuff, because at the end of the day, it's not very complicated, for one. But two, it's like, just focus on like having fun and enjoying your time making weird sounds. Okay, so we're gonna cut this out to where it's just gonna be the kick and snare real quick. So here we go. Now normally what I usually do is I've got this drum bus right here that says fundamentals, and that's where I'll put my kick and snare. But what you do for side chaining is this is just one way that you can help make things take turns. So when we play this with the bass, they're going to be playing over each other. So because the kick is in the low range, and sometimes the snare can be in the low range, and the bass is in the low range, all three of these elements are competing. Maybe not the kick and the snare because they're playing at different times, but maybe you have a kick, like a 4/4 pattern, to where you have a snare over that. So you might actually want to EQ your snare to make space to layer the kick over that. Okay, yeah, whatever. But mainly with the kick and the bass, right? They're both low range. So if you stack them on top of each other, then sometimes it can not sound so good. So something that you might want to try is grabbing, you can do this in so many ways. Well, let's just keep it with compression, but I'm going to use a dynamics from Bitwig here. And we are going to send this to audio 5. And I'm going to set this to pre. And the reason why I'm going to set this to pre is because if I mute this, that means that it's going to turn the side chaining off. But what this is acting as a trigger now. This dynamics is, hold on, this dynamics is being triggered by the kick and the snare. So it's being triggered by the blue. So every time this hits, it's going to fire this and basically say, I'm going to duck the sound. Now, how much this sound is going to be ducked by is based off of this little elbow looking curve thing here and this threshold. And that gets back into the same thing about what compression does. But this time, it's not going to be triggered until another sound activates it. So if I were to leave this off of no sidechain, then it's going to listen to the bass itself. But if I have something else being sent to it, then that means it's not going to be activated on the bass until a kick or a snare says, go or activate, right? And then that's where the same things come into play with our attack and our release. So if I have relatively fast attack and a relatively long release, this is going to be too long, but now one thing I wanted to tell you when you do this is generally if you have something that says makeup gain and you are sidechaining something, leave the makeup gain off. The reason why is because if you have makeup gain and the sidechain isn't being triggered, it's actually going to boost the volume to the full makeup gain that you have it set to when no kick or snare is playing or when you're not sidechaining anything. So when you're doing this, especially if you're first learning, I suppose you could do some creative stuff with it. So I'm not trying to say like never do this, but you generally don't want to have some kind of makeup gain on this. This fortunately does not, so no sweat. I guess you can increase the output if you wanted to, but don't even touch it. But when you're doing side chaining, general rule of thumb, leave it off. So now that I'm going to lower the threshold, you're going to see that the lower the threshold, the more that this sound is going to be ducked. So check this out. Now you see these little curves right here. I wish that I could pause that, but I can't. But this is how much the trigger is ducking the sound, literally reducing the entire volume of the bass in order to leave space for that kick and snare. Now the thing with this is that you don't always necessarily want it to just be such a strong pumping effect. Most of the time you're looking for something kind of like a blend, and so this goes back into answering that question of, well, how much? You got to listen to the thing, right? You have to say, well, now I can't even hear the bass because the release is too long, right? And then this isn't doing anything. So you got to kind of find a happy middle ground in between of something that sounds really good to you, to your ears, or talk to some people that are in your genre and say like, hey, what's a general rule of thumb for how long my release time should be for dubstep or for drum and bass or whatever it is. So I'll give you one very fast clue. Let's say we just want to remove the thump of this kick, right? So what I can do on this is I can actually set this to loop, and you'll see here that this is 0.1 milliseconds, I believe. So sorry, here's our time code. Sorry, I had that incorrect. So if you look here at this time code, we're at 00, but then if you click on right here, this says 1.09. So that means that it's going to take pretty much 10 milliseconds in order for this sound to pretty much be ducked after that. So if I want this sidechain to be linked to the duration of that, then what I could do is pretty much set this to a very fast attack and release. It's where this is going to be cutting very quickly just on this part. So as you can see, it's ducking this super duper fast. Likewise, if I wanted this to be longer, let's say I start from here and I look at this time code. So this says 352. So if I want the bass to completely duck until this kick is completely over, then I can set this to 35.2, or it doesn't need to be exact, but something else of the sort. So that way this is going to completely be able to breathe on its own, and then the bass will come in. Now, you're going to have to be careful with this though, because if the sound is super loud all throughout, and you also have a long release, keep in mind that like the more signal that's being like fired into this, it's how long does it take for the sidechain to release the sound after the trigger is being activated. So I don't know if that makes sense or not, but basically what I'm saying is that if this whole duration is here, like this, and you want this to pull off, sometimes you, like, depending on what kind of sound this is or how long you want to wait, right? So if you wanted to do this but you wanted the bass to come back in here, then you can practice that time code. But if it's super long like this and it's cutting the sound all throughout and then you're pulling it back in 35 milliseconds after, there's this in between time that is taking for you to let that come back up. And I know that that's very specific and almost like pedantic, but at the same time, it's just like things to be mindful of if you're really trying to understand sidechaining as a whole. Generally speaking, most people sidechain with just a click. They just sidechain with like a piece of noise that's an impulse. And what they'll do is they'll set their release time on that duration. So if this kick is 35 milliseconds, then they'll have something that's this long, like this, and then from that point they'll adjust their release time to where it will kind of match up somewhere in this region. Hopefully that makes a little bit more sense. So that's a lot of different use cases about how you can use compression both as a sound design means, also as a mixing approach. And this is all theory, okay? There's no right way to do this. There's no wrong way to do this other than, does it sound good or does it sound like hot garbage? So hopefully that was helpful to anybody that's trying to understand some use cases. Notice I said some use cases for compression. This really is a lifetime of like understanding and mastery, because every situation is unique. It's not just like, oh, drums, slap it on, turn this there, whatever, and then it's good to go. It's like, no, you got to listen to the thing. You might see me doing a lot of the same practices on live stream, but that is because I put myself in the same position. I set myself up for the same use cases or the same situations that I'm very familiar with. But if I were to start with a completely different drum loop that I am completely unfamiliar with, you would see me twist these knobs in different ways that is trying to listen to the sound as a whole and say, okay, what does this need? Or what is my intention of what I want to do? And the best way to use compression is to have the intention to know exactly how you want to control the dynamics of your sound. And there's a bunch of other tools that you can use to control dynamics as well, but we'll save that for another time. So before we go, please don't click off the video yet. If you want to support me, Alckemy.com, or book a lesson with me, I'll tell you everything that I know. I'm not really an expert on mixing, to be honest, but these are just some basic principles that I'd like to share. The other thing is, if there's some kind of content that maybe you searched the YouTube for and that you would like to see from me, I'm not saying that I'll do it, but I would love to see what some of your suggestions are, because I've done neuro bass to death. I've done drums to death. I have you come into the stream if you're wondering, like, how do I use a neuro bass, which I've also covered in a video, or how do I do this? So let me know what your questions are, and I'll try to answer some of those. And if you're really into the whole production game or whatever, I'd say join me on my live stream, because that's where I'm really going to help you be like, okay, you made this sound, let's do this with it. Or here's a use case that you can do with it. Kind of like how I talked about with compression today. So finally, I've got a goal. I'm trying to hit 20K before the end of the year. I would love my channel to finally start taking off and, seeing it for what all it could be. But with that in mind, I can't do it without you. So liking the video, leaving some comments, sharing this video. If anybody has questions about compression, it's late. That could be super helpful. But in any case, thank you all so much for listening to me blabber. Hopefully this was useful to you. Let me know what your compression tricks are, if you've got any, and let's have a discussion and all learn something together, because I'm still learning too. Bye, everybody.